Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And if you're just joining us now, welcome. We're glad to have you here on the third day of our summer seminar on research integrity. So just to clarify the way we're doing things, you can ask questions in the Q&A during the talk. Please do so. We'll moderate the questions ourselves, and we can ask them to the speaker after the talk is finished. So let me introduce our next speaker. It is Serge Horbach. He is joining us today on Zoom from Denmark, where he's a postdoc at the University of Aarhus. Serge has a PhD from the University of Nijmegen, and he's been working on research integrity, research misconduct for a number of years now. If you don't know him already, you should probably look him up on Google Scholar. I mean, his publications are really excellent. Today, he's here with us to talk about responsible peer review, expectations, formal and informal practices. So, Serge, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jeroen, and welcome all. I hope you have been enjoying some very interesting sessions and days already, and I hope to contribute in this line. Yes, indeed. Today we'll discuss a bit peer review practices. That means in this case journal peer review practices and how they may contribute to detecting issues regarding research integrity, detecting issues of potential scientific misconduct. Well, and as you've all been warmed up a lot over the past hours, days even, and there's very little need for me to tell you about these kinds of issues, science being in a state of crisis, whatever sort of crisis that may be, a replication crisis, a reproducibility crisis, a crisis of trust, a crisis of integrity. Many different labels have passed in the discussion. But integrity seems to play a major role in this. A key question that we should ask then is the integrity of what really is it that we are discussing? Usually, I think people, when stating these questions or when discussing these matters, they refer to the integrity of the author. So integrity issues of people who plagiarize, fake their data, etc. Also, and then especially when we talk about reproducibility crisis and the like, integrity of the scientific record is really discussed. So are the facts or the seemingly facts that we publish, are they true? Are they valid? Can they be reproduced in different settings, etc.? But then there's a whole lot of different aspects of science whose integrity might be at stake. We could discuss the integrity of a reviewer. We could discuss the integrity of a journal. For instance, when relating to fake journals, predatory journals, or well, the integrity of the journal staff and editors, etc. And for all these questions, then the follow-up question arises of integrity being the opposite of misconduct or not. If we do not behave with misconduct, does that then mean that we have integrity? And the like. In our talk today, or in my talk today, I'll mainly focus on integrity issues relating to the latter 2 points here. So integrity issues of review as a process and a reviewer as an individual, as well as integrity issues relating to journals in general. And when we discuss the latter, well, emails like this might arise to your attention. These spam-like emails soliciting input to, well, basically any journal relating to any field of research that one hardly knows anything about. This is one of the emails I received asking me to contribute to a post on post-marketing surveillance. which I really, really do not know anything of, or emails like this, and this is for a conference and a journal, where they promise you to deliver your research and publish it within just a matter of days after you submitted it. Well, all very tempting, but probably all very fake and giving rise to multiple integrity issues. Despite those journals being out there, of course, the majority of journals really tries their best to assure a literature, a scientific literature that is up to stake and is really conforming to all standards of research integrity that we want it to be. And how does it do that? What's the main mechanism, as in according to many people at least, to stop problematic science spreading through the academic literature? It's peer review. It's this standard where we all discuss each other's work. It's part and core of science, one of our self-regulating mechanisms that is really expected to be key in all this. And it's been given a high level of responsibility, I would say, both as a system in a whole, but that then also means to the individuals that are practicing this system. So just the editors, the reviewers, us, the scientific community, acting in this regard. But of course, peer review is not a sacred thing. There are several integrity challenges itself arising within the process and due to the process of peer review, really. Well, let's get those out up front. Of course, there's these issues of objective review. To what extent are reviewers objective? Reviewers, in many cases, might review for competitors. So people with similar research interests that might have similar ambitions and goals, might be working on very similar issues. And it might then, due to all sorts of conflicts of interest, be tempting for reviewers to, for several reasons, delay publications, reject manuscripts that are factually, or in fact, very, very proper science and should be published. They might favor certain authors, certain methods, certain topics, certain approaches to questions, and all the like. There might be issues, again, relating more to the journal of fake peer review or no peer review at all. These questions are becoming more and more pressing these days, and retractions appearing for these kinds of reasons at increasing rates. Of course, there's the good old plagiarism of idea or text by reviewers, which has been a problem in the past for many decades now. Of course, with the arrival of plagiarism detection software, committing plagiarism in itself is not as tempting as it might have been previously. There have been issues also lately with reviewers forcing references upon authors. I think every one of you who has been in review or has had articles in review, well, notices or can resemble to these practices, where when you receive a review report, it asks you to add certain reference here or there. And even if review is blind, as in you don't know who the reviewer is, looking at the suggested references might usually be quite an effective way of identifying who this reviewer might be. And then lastly, or at least last on my list, there might be issues of expertise, very, very difficult issues of expertise, and who has the right or sufficient expertise to act as a reviewer. With review practices opening up and more adhering to community review practices where broader audiences are invited to review. These issues become more and more prominent, and I think in many cases we do not have sufficiently clear answers to this, but I think very important and relevant, interesting questions. So even though peer review as a system is highly lauded and heralded as one of the core principles of science, itself as a practice, as well as its practitioners, come along with several challenges regarding research integrity. Nevertheless, we always, or at least the vast majority of scholars, as well as the wider public, envision peer review to be this core element of science that we really, to some extent, cannot do without. It's so central to what we do that people, even though all these challenges are here, they say, well, it's the best option we have, so we should stick to this. Regarding that question, it might be interesting to give you some historical perspective on peer review. How old is it as a system and how has it evolved? Well, for that, some popular accounts of peer review as a system say that it dates back to the first journal and the first articles being published. This is actually the front page of the first ever published journal, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in London. And as you see, this first issue was published in the second half of the 17th century, so quite a while back. And some, again, popular accounts of peer review say that it was also this first issue and this first journal when peer review as a practice emerged. But I would object to that, and with me several historians of science, because really in these old days, it was just a single editor making decisions about articles being published or not. So it was really not the same thing as we have in peer review now, with external reviewers being solicited to provide their opinions. And in these first days, it was not so much the quality or the relevance or whatever, or the novelty of articles that was being assessed. Peer review or the editorial review, as it was then, really aimed as a service to the king to filter out any problematic stuff that should not be published, that might in some way or another be unfavorable to the king. And it much more resembled a kind of book censorship. It was only in the late 19th century that some external reviewers emerged. That happened in several journals more or less simultaneously, the British Medical Journal being one of them and being a very prominent example. But this practice of external reviewers being asked to comment on papers and thereby help the editor make decisions about publication or rejection was only installed on a wider basis far into the 20th century, with very prominent journals such as Nature really only installing peer review, or at least as we know it today, well after the Second World War, so even in the 70s only. And in fact, the real term peer review itself was not used before the 1960s. So peer review really as a system is not as old as you might think, or at least not as old as some people make us believe that it is. and suggesting that it's really a core part of science, something that we really cannot do without. Well, science has existed for much longer than this practice of peer review. So at least there are some ways of alternatives to work with these. Just to illustrate the fact that peer review is not as old as we might think, this is this interesting and quite well-known example of Einstein in the second half of the 30s, being very angry when he finds out that one of his articles was sent out to some peers before it was being published. Well, just showing that people were really not used to having their articles reviewed just 80, 90 years ago. So peer review as a system is not as old as you might think. It's also not as uniform or homogeneous as you might think. Peer review really comes in many forms and shapes and different tastes. Over its existence, really, it has developed in many ways, where first, well, just the mere fact who is reviewing has developed from the single editor, who one can, in many cases, hardly call a peer. The practice moved into editorial committees or small groups of people making decisions for all manuscripts for a single journal, into this practice of external reviewers being entering the stage in the last century. Then, of course, there are different tastes and flavors that people use regarding anonymity or openness of peer review practices. Initially aimed to tackle bias and inequality in science and publishing. We have, of course, the double blind, the single blind, or more open forms of peer review, where either the identities of the editor, the reviewer, or the authors might or might not be known to other actors in the system. Also, many changes have occurred regarding the timing of peer review in the peer review process or in the publication process, where this could be a typical timeline for drafting an article and publishing it. You have the traditional timing of peer review being after you write your manuscript and before you publish it. But today we also have these alternative practices where registered reports emerged, reviewing before data collection and data analysis occurs, or post-publication peer review happening only after publication. And then there's a much wider range of all sorts of varieties that can come to peer review, whether regarding the usage of IT tools or the usage of commercial services in peer review or cooperation between journals. We can have specialist reviews such as statistics reviewers. So there's a whole wide variety of different peer review practices. And well, it then becomes this question again, who gets to be involved in peer review, and are these all still peers? Well, again, especially in post-publication peer review, where wider communities are invited to comment on papers, one can really ask what the boundary of a peer still is and to what extent we can still really call this practice peer review. But then having this whole variety and range of different practices, we come back to this question of how effective are they really in preventing problematic science from spreading to the literature. So how effective are these mechanisms in detecting potential issues of misconduct, fraud, or just sloppy science before stuff is being published? Well, it's very difficult to get some real hard numbers on this, but there is some evidence. I'll present a small bit of this from my own studies, where we traced retractions or retraction rates and related those to different forms of performing peer review. And then you actually see some differences. So for instance, what we notice is that when you ask journals which quality criteria they use for the selection of their papers, we see that the more criteria they use, the more likely they are to retract papers. And this is especially so for journals selecting on anticipated impact or the expected novelty of an article. Something similar becomes visible when we look at the anonymity of authors in a review process. So distinguishing between single and double-blind review practices. Then we see that when author identities are known to the editor, we again see relatively more retracted articles. So nearly all articles really that are retracted go through this single blind format, while nearly none of the retracted articles go through double blind peer review. And this effect becomes even more obvious when we distinguish between research fields. So here we see the STEM and social science and humanities fields separated. And then you see that in the social sciences and humanities, all non-retracted articles, or nearly 80% of all non-retracted articles, actually go through double-blind peer review, where nearly all, or over 80% of all retracted articles went through single-blind review. So the way in which we organize our peer review practices really seems to make a difference on, well, the number of retractions appearing. And if we consider retractions as a sign of some article slipping through peer review, with then major issues being found later, we could actually say that peer review practices do matter and are, to some extent, in some form, an effective way of detecting fraud. But get some input from you as well. I prepared some poll questions, which were set up by the organizing committee. So if we could launch the first poll question, this would be the time to do that. Just looking at the organizers and hoping they could launch the first question here. So I see something's appearing on the screen, but it's so small in my screen that I can't read it now. But let's see. Yeah, so there are the first answers coming up, but again, this is now unfortunately a bit small. I can make it bigger. So, interestingly, so far, many of you, when reading a peer-reviewed article, seem to assume that this article is fraud-free. So when an article has the label of being peer-reviewed, we actually assume, well, then this should be of, well, some way of high quality, at least fraud-free. Okay, interesting. Let's go to the next question. So when performing a peer review, so if you think of yourself as a reviewer, do you check the manuscript for signs of misconduct or questionable research practices? And do you consider that a job or a task for you as a reviewer to look into this? Some more mixed answers, but still the majority is saying that they actually do, which is an optimistic sign, a good sign. Okay, let's wait a few more seconds for some more answers perhaps to come in. And then let's go to the last poll question, which is quite similar. It's slightly different, because when performing a peer review, do you not only check the manuscript, but do you also check the data for signs of misconduct or questionable research practices? Of course, if such data are there, you might have many papers without data. If data are there, do you check those for signs of misconduct? Well, this is very honest of you, and people usually, at least the majority, seems not to do this. And this is actually perhaps a bit too along the lines of what we might have expected. Because let us move back to the slides and then on the screen. So if we could, yes, great, thank you. Can we really expect reviewers to detect all these issues or potential issues of research misconduct? Is it feasible that reviewers detect this? And especially given the fact that review is usually a voluntary job, you do this on a voluntary basis, you're not rewarded for that. Can we expect people to go through entire lengths, even checking all the data and underlying data of a manuscript to detect such issues? Well, some people would argue that we can expect this. This was a post on Retraction Watch not so long ago, when an article was retracted after Elizabeth Big detected some issues of this in this article. You might have seen these kinds of plots and these kinds of issues. She's quite famous now in detecting all these kinds of issues. And of course, the thing she does, a reviewer could have done in the very same way, at least if such a reviewer would have had the right set of expertise again. But then no matter what format we use or what reviewer enters the stage, some cases of problematic research will always slip through, of course. And then the question becomes, how do we deal with this in our daily research practices? Because, well, with post-publication peer review entering the stage, one can argue that new forms of review, also after publication, could help to detect this or these kinds of issues. But really, I always wonder how new this kind of post-publication review really is, because isn't that what we always have been doing? There are these all informal practices of peer review. When we read an article, when we cite an article, when you build on previous work, you would, at least I expect, go into this paper and to some extent review it for yourself, and only if you determine it to be of sufficiently high quality, you would actually use it, build on it, or cite it. So these are these daily practices by all researchers that can help in detecting or omitting any of these problematic research articles. Nevertheless, all kinds of studies suggest that a worrying degree of problematic citing practices is out there as well. If you go through these surveys on questionable research practices, problematic citing practices usually top the list of things people are willing to admit that they engage in. We always see these phenomena of retracted articles keeping to be cited also long after they've been retracted. And we just have these incredibly nice and fascinating stories about all kinds of flawed or incorrect citations spreading through the literature. So really, there's an opportunity for all of us as scholars in our daily practices to improve our way of performing post-publication peer review. So to conclude, and as my last slide, what have we learned today? What are the messages we can take home with us? There are concerns about problematic science spreading through the academic literature, and these concerns are rising. Various kinds of peer review might be an effective mechanism to prevent such things from happening. We should always ask ourselves, to what extent can we expect reviewers to act as such a filtering mechanism? And whatever mechanism or system we use, none of it's going to be infallible. So our daily research practices of informal ways of doing review through reading, citing, building on each other's work, I think that's where much of the improvement can be made. So that's all I wanted to share with you today. I'm very interested to hear your questions and go into some discussion with you. So thanks for that. And
all right, thanks so much, Serge. This was wonderful, very thought-provoking. So maybe I can start with a question that I'm sure has been on everyone's minds, and maybe it's a little bit off topic, but what is the deal with reviewer 2? I mean, why are they so evil and nasty all the time?
Well, are they?
Well, I know my reviewers too tend to be that way.
Well, yes, of course. I completely agree that there's a wide variety, not only in different mechanisms and standards or systems of performing peer review, but also a wide range of practices that reviewers, just as individual people, adhere to. And the quality of peer review reports is really, indeed, they can be amazing or they can be, well, not so much.
That's an understatement, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is, and I'm sure later today, other speakers, I guess Anna Marusic speaking after me will go into this as well.
Yeah.
This is, of course, for editors, a major concern to find the right people and to act as constructive, honest reviewers.
Yeah. So, Serge, before we go to the other questions, would you mind stop sharing your screen so we can see you full size?
Yes.
Thanks.
Stop share.
Great. A question from Sovik Dasgupta. I'm interested to know your Serge's opinion on the blinding process of peer review. He says, I've always felt single blind methods introduce some sort of bias as the reviewers and editors can see the author's details. But do you think double blind or fully open review is the way to go forward? Or do you see some merits of the single blind procedure?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Thanks for bringing this up. And I think indeed we see some interesting phenomena going on here. Well, indeed, the single blind peer review process, which has the longest history, it was the common standard in many fields, and in several it still is. But to tackle these kinds of bias, two really drastically different systems are emerging now. And when we asked journal editors which system they are using, we see increasingly many moving into either end of the spectrum. So journals tend to be moving away from this single blind format into either the double blind or the radically open system, both aiming to address the same issue, but then either by adhering to matters of transparency. So if you can keep reviewers accountable of what they're doing, then we might expect them to behave better or perform better peer reviews. Or if we just close it down completely and make sure they don't know who the author is, then you might also be able to erase some of these biases. Well, I think time is still to tell which of these systems is most favorable, at least when it comes to addressing issues of research integrity. In our study, we found double blind being more effective than single blind, but it was very hard still for us to assess open peer review practices because there were just very few journals at that time adhering to that system.
Right. Thanks, Serge. A question from Heather Tierney. Regarding peer review, the poll asked about misconduct and responsible research, but can you comment on your views on the differences between publication ethics versus research ethics, and if peer review is intended more toward the former than the latter, or do we expect peer review to evaluate both, maybe?
Oh, also a very interesting question. And then, well, we should go into some definition perhaps about what we exactly mean with publication and research ethics, and how to distinguish the two. But indeed, coming back to my initial question, well, the integrity of what is it really that we're discussing here? And of course, peer review addresses many of the issues relating to, well, the integrity in the publication system, which I guess you refer to here as publication ethics. But then also in the poll question, and I think this is a much more general thing, people tend to assume that once peer review has been performed, also issues of research ethics or research integrity are properly dealt with. So when we read peer-reviewed articles, people just seem to assume that the system has been able to detect and filter all kinds of issues, also including research ethics issues.
All right, good. So here's another intriguing question from Roberto Buccione. And it has to do with grant applications, because we're not only peer reviewing articles, we're also peer reviewing grant applications. So there's been publicized stories about sort of plagiarism and theft of intellectual ideas from people who peer review grants. So the question is basically, and of course, I mean, this is hard to get data about because it's usually confidential, and not all these grant applications are then made public. So do you have any thoughts on this, and is there a way forward to deal with that problem, which can be particularly devastating for researchers who submit these grant applications?
Yes, absolutely. This is a serious issue. And one indeed, I think it is very difficult also to do anything about. But well, the solution might be here in one of the things you already alluded to, that this system is still opposed to the journal peer review system, usually very, very confidential and closed. So transparency in these systems is really still well, lacking a lot of the times. And whilst it's still not very clear whether transparency might contribute to a more or to higher standards of integrity during peer review, there are some signs that it does, and in case it does, then this might also apply to application peer review, rather than just journal peer review.
Right. A question from Alma Linkevichuti. Is post-publication peer review different in multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary settings where different areas of research meet?
Well, post-publication peer review, I think, again, comes in many forms and shapes. But what it usually aims to do is, again, including wider communities and more diverse backgrounds and sets of expertise into the review process. And this then might indeed particularly be interesting for multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary journals, where research is being done on the crossroads of several intellectual and epistemic communities and cultures. And in such cases, just inviting one or two or three reviewers might not be enough, and hence these community approaches to not inviting specific people, but just having it open for everyone and to comment on papers might be particularly relevant and particularly helpful strategies. Yes.
Right. A question from Marion that draws a nice connection between something that we'll talk more about this afternoon, publishers and the role of publishers in peer review. I mean, as we often complain, these publishers make a lot of money, but the question is, couldn't they fulfill a bigger or a more active or proactive role in quality checking, sort of in addition to peer reviewers? And I mean, the question is really, wouldn't it be nice if we actually received some quality checking back for all the money that's being spent on publishers? And we'll keep this in mind for this afternoon, but maybe you have thoughts on it too.
Yes, well, I'm very sure that indeed some of the speakers later today, Joris van Rossum and Katharina, will be able to share more insights on this. But in fact, such practices are the common standard already, and at least the large commercial publishers. They actually do perform several, at least internal checks. Well, plagiarism detection software is by now very much a standard thing in all of these publication processes with these publishers. But also checks on image manipulations are increasingly appearing there. Other ethical checks. So to some extent, yes, they are being done, though in many cases this happens behind the scenes. We don't know exactly what they do, what they check for, how they do that, and to what standards they hold our papers. So if anything, then a lot of transparency might be gained here or might be improved upon.
Yeah. All right. So here's a final question. It's an intriguing one. So Erin Makri writes, I have peer-reviewed a paper that was rejected in one journal, only to be asked to peer-review that same paper again for a new journal, but only to discover substantial changes to the reported methodology. What to do in such cases of likely falsification of reporting? And the more general issue, I guess, is the continuity of peer review between different journals.
Yes, this is a very, very interesting topic you addressed here, and something I've been thinking about a lot, and hope to continue thinking about in the future. Because indeed, this is what we so often see, that papers being rejected for whatever reason, including potential issues of fraud or misconduct, are then just simply being submitted at other journals, and then the communication or interaction between journals and publishers is still just not sufficient to detect these kinds of issues and to prevent research of being published in the end anyway, anywhere. So yeah, this is really something we need to address at some point, but I don't think we have the solutions yet. And it would be very interesting to continue thinking about this.
That sounds fair enough. Yeah. So thanks a bunch, Serge, for a wonderful talk and a lively Q&A session. This is it as far as your session is concerned. So hopefully we'll see you again during the panel this afternoon. Thanks for now, and I'm going to introduce the next speaker.
Okay, and thanks for the invitation, and have a good day all.
Virtual applause for Serge. So our next speaker, and it is an honor to introduce her, is Anna Marusic. Anna is Professor of Anatomy and Chair of the Department of Research in Biomedicine and Health at the University of Split School of Medicine in Croatia. So she has a very long and impressive CV. I'm not going to list everything that's on it, but I want to mention a couple of quick things that are particularly relevant to her topic today. So in addition to being a professor of anatomy in Croatia, she is also an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. She is the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Global Health, and perhaps most importantly for today's topic, she has been the president of several editorial organizations, so she has a lot of experience as an editor and also as someone who advocates on behalf of editors, who thinks about policies for journals. And that's really why we invited her here today, to talk about the editor's perspective, how to deal with a changing publication system. So Anna, thanks for being here with us today, and the screen is yours.
Thank you. I hope it is my screen, because I'm trying to share the screen, so I hope
it is your screen, loud and clear.
Okay, good. Thank you. So thank you very much. It was interesting to follow the discussion. I like the presentation on authorship and questions. Authorship is one of my research questions, so I really enjoyed the talk, and I could have a lot to say, but I hope to continue the discussion in another format. And also the questions for Serge were also, some of the questions were for journal editors. And my talk will be from the point of view of journal editors. I do a lot of research in evidence-based medicine, but also in research integrity. But I'm also, for many years, too many that I want to admit, I have been editor-in-chief of 2 journals so far, and very active in editorial association. So I was asked to present the perspective of editors, how to deal with the changing publication system. And there are so many things that have changed in the publication system that I'm going to talk only about some of them. And I do look forward to the question and discussion afterwards. And maybe I will be able to answer the questions that were put to Serge about, quality check, about the transparency of the system. I know that mostly we think, especially about peer review system or journals, that it's a kind of a black box. You send something in and something comes out and you don't know what's happening in. But I think that now we have more transparency about what's happening in journals, and also these kind of forwarding peer reviews from journal to journal. The last question to Serge, maybe that we can talk about that later, or maybe ask questions again. So my talk will be about, the place of journals and journal editors, because they are the ones that are making decisions of what's going to be published in a journal, where their place is in this kind of a spectrum of research integrity. And then I will talk about what we as journal editors can do, and have kind of a very quick and dirty SWOT analysis, what our strengths and what our weaknesses are, and then concentrate on a few examples of how we try to contribute or how we deal with the challenges that have emerged recently in the publication system. So when there was a question to Serge about, what's the difference between publication integrity and research integrity? And I think we have to look at them as a kind of a spectrum, because you cannot put a barrier between research and publication. Publication actually starts when you start planning your research. You already have some literature, you may have some methodology written down, you create tables, figures, you have some data that you analyze, and you have to visualize it, and you make tables and figures before you start writing a paper. And writing a paper comes at some point in research where you want to see where you are and where you have to go then. So reporting comes at the end of research process during a study or something, from design, conduct, analysis, and it is a part of this spectrum. And also, when you look at the responsible research and bad research, misconduct, that's also a spectrum where it goes from honest error, which is then again, I'm going to talk about the challenge that we have today of having research that there was an honest mistake and it needs to be retracted and maybe republished, and how to differentiate it from retractions that are due to misconduct and perhaps actual fraud. So we also have to keep in mind that this is also a spectrum, and that they range, and this is reflected in a paper, from technical problems or weak methods because of insufficient knowledge, all the sloppy science that you talked about, to actually poor reporting, where you have salami science, where people publish least publishable units from their research, where they reference poorly, where there is image manipulation, data trimming to kind of spin the results, and finally ending up in what is actually fraud and what you can end up in jail for plagiarism, falsification, and fabrication of FFPs that we have. So where is the ethical responsibility of editors and their journals? So our primary role is also, to be the gatekeepers of science, to help assess what is good, to vet research results and to publish them. And this is particularly important in some research fields, like in medicine. And you will see that most of the standards that we have started from the biomedical field, because what we publish can kill people, can really affect the health of individuals or of populations. So we are particularly careful of what we published. We are kind of over standardizing and over regulating the processes and what we publish. So reporting checklists came from medicine in order to ensure that the reporting is complete, so that the validity of the study could be assessed properly, and especially included in evidence synthesis, which is very important for providing guidance for clinical practice. But one of the important thing is that we as editors are also responsible for the integrity of the published record. So we are responsible for what is published, and also we're responsible to make a correction if the correction is needed. And I'm also going to talk a tiny bit about that. There are so many things that we can discuss, and 1 hour is not enough. And why research integrity or misconduct, if you want to talk about the bad stuff, why it is always related to the journals I'm citing here, Claxton, who had a series of articles on authorship in the beginning of this century, and he said rightfully so that most of the allegations and finding of misconduct are about publishing, because when you publish something, this is probably the best documents of what you do as a researcher, apart from your lab books or from your data that you have in your lab and that people around you may know. But the public knows research when it is published. And this is the reason why most of the allegations of research misconduct come after something is published. So my argument is that if we are there placed well to detect scientific misconduct, if the journals are the places where this is visible, then we as journal editors are also well placed to prevent it, to promote responsible conduct of research, and also to deal something with it. But we cannot do it alone. And I'm not going to go into the problems of how journals can collaborate with institutions when there is an allegation of misconduct. I will talk a little bit about, COPE guidelines that we use and flowcharts to guide us in this process, but it's quite more complicated than it is. And if you ask yourselves, okay, where is publishing? If you look at something that is kind of the foundation of responsible conduct of research in Europe now, where it is a kind of a soft law it was in Horizon 2020 and is now in Horizon Europe, which is specifically mentioned as a requirement that you sign when you have an EU grant. So publication and dissemination and reviewing, evaluation and editing are also part of the responsible conduct of research, and it is there in the code of conduct. It is also for the authors, but also when you act as a journal editor, publishing negative results also concerns you, not only as a researcher, but also as an editor. Responsible actions and behavior, and when you're reviewing, when you're evaluating, and this also is important not only for journals, but also for any evaluation of any kind, including grants and so on, managing conflicts of interest and so on. So these are all the aspects of editorial work that is that has been there forever, but many things have changed. And I will just go a tiny bit into the history, because it's always good to know your enemy, so to say, when we're dealing with a problem. And this is how journals looked when they were first published more than 350 years ago in 1665, the Journal des Scavan and the philosophical transactions. They were just simple texts, and this is fascinating, and because you can go to the philosophical transactions because they have digitized their content, and you can, when you go to their archive site on the web, you can go actually to the first issue in 1665 and read the actual PDF like it is shown here. But today we have what is called a enhanced publication, because in this narrative part of the traditional publication is now connected to additional material, all kinds of data sets, other publication, images, tables, workloads, devices. So they have a permanent identifier in the web, like DOI or something, and they look different. This is just one example of kind of a recent one, where you can see that you can have interactive charts, you can have interactive maps, you can have videos in some other ones, and there are all kinds of different additional content and features that you see here that are available. So you have to know that today in publishing, we're not dealing not only with manuscript that you make 3 copies of and send to a journal, but it's much more complicated. And those of you who have submitted in a submission system know that you need about like 2 to 3 hours almost to submit a paper, because there is so much additional data and questions that are asked of you when you're submitting it. And this is all part of this kind of quality assurance to make sure that the submission is complete, that it's transparent, and that it can ease the work of the publishers. And not only that, but if you look at how peer review have changed and what Serge talked about, we have drastically changed the peer review, and now you have so many options. And we started very simply. We started from the peer review that came maybe almost kind of a century after the start of journals, scientific journals, but now we have pre-publication peer review, post-publication open peer review, all kinds of different aspects of discussing or evaluating scientific work that is submitted to a journal. You have decoupled post-publication open peer review, all kinds of different types of peer review. Even when we talk about open peer review is not one single type of peer review, but you can have at least like 3 or 4 different versions of what is open to the final reader. So this is the reason why we as editors have standards, and maybe this is the answer to Serge's question about, and that question about transparency of editorial work. It should be transparent because we have editorial standards and they should be visible in the policies of the journals which are there for the authors to read. But then the question is, do authors actually read the author's instructions and policies of the journal, or just hurry to submit their work to be published as soon as possible? So we have standards, and I'm just here listing some of the standards that are reflected then in the policies of the journals, and this is mostly for the biomedical field where I come from. So in a single journal, we would be implementing editorial standards. We would have a call for the standards. For example, for us, it will be International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. We have standards for the peer review process, for the correcting the published record, authorship, competing interests. For us, it's very important to have ethics issue addressed, also the trial registration, privacy protection for research on humans, and so on and so on. And then one thing, because in many fields, and that is true for medicine, journal editors are also researchers, and and they may have interests. So how to deal with competing interests of editors in their own journals? That's also an important thing that has emerged as a challenge in publishing in medicine. And actually, when you look at what we as editors can do, and I know that when I'm an author, I have lots of complaints about editors, and then when I'm in the role of the editor, I have a lot of complaints about authors. But I just want to have a kind of a brief look of where or what we as editors can do, and this is like a very small SWOT analysis of the strengths and weaknesses that we have as persons or journals, and also the opportunities and threats that are there outside of the journal editor. So definitely editors can do much more. And this is an answer to Serge's question that we should do much more, because regardless of what we are, whether it's the editor of a highly influential, high impact journal, or an editor of a small scholarly journal in a small scientific community, we are the authority in scientific community, and what editors say counts for many things. That's why we have an edit responsibility. So we also should have independence. Sometimes it's very difficult to have it, and sometimes we have to fight for it. And there have been examples of sacking editors, including JAMA, New England Journal editors, when they wanted to fight for their independence. We are also researchers, so we have expertise in research. We have this responsibility for the integrity of the published record, and we have this power to formulate policies that can help increase the transparency and trust in the published record. We also have opportunities, because as you see, what is published is the first place where people are going to look, and this is where allegation of misconduct can come from. So we are well positioned to detect scientific misconduct. We have new technologies to help us in that. We can develop editorial policies, and they have been developed by international organizations. There are also policies by national and international ethics and integrity body, and this enhanced publication and in greater transparency of both the publications and the corrections to these publications on the web is something that is helping us to promote responsible publishing practices. We also have weaknesses, because we cannot do much legally, so we don't have a legal power. We can be a part of an investigation, but not really legally, except when, I don't know, we can retract an article because of, I don't know, duplicate publication, because of plagiarism. We have that power, and we have few means of actions. We can express concern and retract. We cannot take away somebody's PhD degree because of the falsification and fabrication. Very often, but this is changing now, editors don't want to be involved in these delicate issues because they think that brings bad name and reputation to the journal. But now, actually, when you look at overall, journals are really taking this responsibility for the integrity of the published record very seriously, and now it's a sign of journal quality and strength if they retract and correct articles. It's no more a sign of a bad journal, but it's actually a sign of quality and responsibility. And definitely you have to be aware that all of these standards and everything that we now have to do in a journal takes time, takes education, resources, and this is what most of the journals don't have. Only some journals, a small number of journals out of, I don't know, in medicine, there are at least 18,000 and up to 25,000 periodic publications in medicine, according to the National Library of Medicine. Most of them are not these commercial journals that have a publisher, but they are mostly small journals, scholarly journals with an editor that is a volunteer, that doesn't have a big office to publish, so it's quite difficult to achieve this. And there are also threats, and we have to be aware that this culture of research integrity differs across different countries. It's defined legally very differently, and Serge could tell you about that too, about the differences in research integrity regulations in different countries. There is not much training now, it's getting better. Then we also need to be supported by all different stakeholders. There are always pressures to publish. And also there is, I come from a post-communist country, and we have to be aware of that corruption is not only in politics, but also in the scientific community, and those policymakers that have to do it. And actually, when you look at editors, this is a quotation from Ernest Hart, who was the editor of the BMJ in the 19th century, that who said that editor needs and must have enemies, that you can't do without them. And if everybody thinks good about you, then you're not a good editor. So the editor is there to be provocative and to lead and to kind of follow the change, but not in all things, in not the internet of things, but in only those things that matter to them. So when you look at what we can do, there are many editorial policies like the Council of Science Editors. In Europe, we have the European Association of Science Editors, ICMJE have its recommendation. World Association of Medical Editors is also a body that is very important for medical journals. And then finally, we have COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is the largest organization that is specifically deals with publication ethics and publication integrity. For example, when you look at what ICMJE does, so it defines the roles and responsibilities, and also defines the interactions and mutual responsibility between different actors in publishing, from the authors to the journal owners, editors, and also about participants as important stakeholders in research. They also address a number of publishing and editorial issues, like how to correct, retract, republish, how to control versions, how to deal with the allegation of misconduct, how to deal with copyright, especially now in digital publishing and Creative Commons replacing licenses replacing copyright, what to do if you have overlapping complications. We also have a duty to allow discussion about publications after publishing. So what to deal with the correspondence, how to deal with different aspects of publishing, what about advertising, how do we deal with media, and especially in medicine about clinical trials. And then these are the standards of how we do it. And then Committee on Publication Ethics has a number of resources for us to deal with these issues, or from flowcharts, which are like action-based, a decision tree, what to do if you have for example, here it is, if you have an allegation from the reviewer or a reader that there is a plagiarism in manuscript, then we have all of these decision trees, what to do, when to contact the institution, and so on and so on. So there are quite a number of, if I can go back, so we have flowcharts, there are all kinds of discussion documents for the emerging issues that are being put forward in the publishing world. We have all kinds of guidelines. There are lots of cases because people bring their problems, and because nothing is black and white, and there is usually no simple answer to many of the problems that we see in publishing. And this guides us in our work to ensure the integrity of the published record. So this is an example of this flowchart. And then, for example, we have now, and Serge showed some examples of, and I just like to show this one, how image manipulation, especially in biomedical research, is very important. You see here some bands on a gel from a lab, and it looks very nice and very clean. But then when you look at what's happening, what's really behind this, you see that there are lines that were cut, added, removed, and so on and so on. And this is all really bad behavior. And this is something that we now have tools to. This is why I'm showing this, because we have these tools. For example, Office of Research Integrity has these forensic droplets that you can download in your Photoshop. And then, just like as authors can manipulate the image, then we can also discover what's happening, what has been done to this image. And the general rule is that an image cannot be manipulated or changed in any way. Nothing could be added, removed, enhanced, and that all information from the figure must be there. But then again, this is also an example that I thank to David Waugh from Australia, who is a cancer researcher with a hobby of looking for statistical errors in high impact factor journals. And when you see this sloppiness in data presentation, then you really can wonder what's happening with the journals. How come nobody can see that? For example, this is an example from a cell. It's a figure, so you have some these bars with standard errors on top. And when you read what the authors say, and this is here circled in orange, so it says bars represent average plus minus means from two experiments. And anybody who has a little bit of knowledge of statistics know that average and mean are the same things, that it should be average plus minus, I don't know, standard deviation, or what usually they like to do in basic science biomedical papers, the standard error of the mean, which is a wrong way to indicate data variability. And then you wonder, so this has been published, and editor has read it, and editors, and there were peer reviewers who read it, and they didn't notice this like mistake that I would flunk my first year medical students when they come to their statistics class. So then issues like this and examples like this really put into question, is this, can we trust what is published and what was talked about before? And also one particular question is something that has emerged recently, is republishing an article that had an honest error. So retraction of articles that have some form of misconduct is clear. This should be retracted, it should be indicated. But what if it is an honest error? So mistake in calculation would change the conclusion of the study, and journal editors have tried to kind of address this specific problem with what is called retraction with republication, or retraction with replacement. So when there is an honest error, then a new paper should be published. Of course, the first one had to be retracted, and there should be an explanation of why and what changes were made. And this kind of creates confusion, because what we as journal editors would like to do and think of a new way, like retraction with republication thing, it doesn't fit into bibliographical the structure of PubMed. So this is just a fact sheet from PubMed that says, okay, these are the things that we do. We can publish errata, we can publish expression of concern, and we're going to mark it and index it as such, and so on. But retraction is retraction. They don't differentiate between articles that are retracted because of error or anything else that is there that can be scientific misconduct. And then the problem is that when you look at retracted publication, for example, you have, this is an example from JAMA, that the problem with the editors is they want to use the same DOI, so the same identification for both articles, because they are single articles, it has been changed. So they would like to have citations to both articles together, because it's a kind of the same article, but just changed a bit. But this is not how National Library of Medicine would look at it. So you have here example of JAMA, where this is an article that has been retracted and replaced with the new version because of an honest error. But because they kept the same DOI, National Library of Medicine is indexing it just as a retraction. Although if you go to the journals page, you see clearly that this article has been retracted and replaced. So that means there is a new version. But in PubMed, you will see only that this is a retracted article. And I think that the journals have changed now this practice that they have to have two separate DOIs, because they are two separate publications. So this comes as kind of an added work to the journal editors, because we have to know more about, how what we publish is indexed, how to adapt, what we want to do as a new policy that is reflected in there. Although when you go there, you have like a letter, so the publication, and then you have a notice of retraction and replacement. So this is something that is very important. We actually did a study, which I don't have time to go into details now, and where we found that when we look at these retracted and republished articles, journals are not consistent how they mark this change. Linking services like Crossmark don't provide clear updates. It's not clear what has happened with it and which is the last version and why. And also indexing databases, if you look, I don't know, from PubMed to Scopus to Web of Science, they also index it in a different way. So if you're someone who is looking from outside and want to see what has happened to an information that had to be changed in the journal, then you may have completely different pictures of what's happening from different databases. So there is a lot of things to do. We are also recently, and this is my, I think next to the last example, so I would like to draw my presentation to the conclusion, is the challenge for preprints. You have talked about preprints. They have been very important in COVID, this is something that has been recognized even by the indexing services that are very difficult to change. For example, the PubMed has introduced a new publication type as a preprint. This is how they define it. They are complete and public drafts of scientific documents, but which have not been certified by peer reviews. And if you go and type in the preprint like publication type in PubMed, you will see that this is a very new thing. They started their pilot testing of this in 2020 for COVID only, and you see that already there are over 2,500 indexed preprint publications, and as I say, they are all about COVID. And this is interesting because, when you look at how it is indexed, okay, you see that this is a preprint, it's quite clear, and so on. But when it gets published, how do you link this? So PubMed also has to come up with a way of showing or indicating that there is a peer-reviewed final version of the paper. So for example, here you have the preprint, that is a preprint, but then this is a paper, a full paper, where it says down at the bottom of the abstract that this is an update of a paper that was published in bioRxiv. So it gets quite complicated, and now we have to also think of this for us. For example, for journal editors, this is also, you know, how we put this in references, how we tag it, how we link it later with the updates when the paper is finally published. And with this, we have, for example, I as an editor publishing reports on COVID, a lot of editors, a lot of journals, authors have references that are preprints. So by the time that get published, there may be already a full publication, how to replace that during the process where everybody wants to be, that it's quick. What if there are corrections? We have noticed, for example, that there were much more corrections of COVID papers than of similar papers, I don't know, from Ebola pre-pandemic time some years ago. So how to deal with it? So what if I, when I'm editing a paper, see that you know, it's indicated, for example, by Crossref that there is a correction? What type of correction? Does it influence what they're saying in the paper? So many things, and everybody wants to publish everything so quickly, but it's really very difficult to make sure that you have addressed all of these issues that can be quite complicated. And also, one of the things that I want to end up with are predatory journals, and they are also a challenge to the publication process, not only because they take away the papers that people would submit to you. I wouldn't even have them called predatory journals, because they are pseudo journals. They deceive, misuse the golden open access, you know, kind of author pay model. There are also conflicts of interest, spamming your email, targeting researchers that are at early stages of their career, smaller communities, as an opportunity for them to publish. They can have fake metrics that you see here, like Einstein Institute for Scientific Information, and so on and so on. They are promising everything that they cannot deliver, and they are actually abusing the system of peer review. And this is in a way one of the answers why it is very difficult to get peer reviews now, is because, first of all, there are so many journals, you know, so much information, at least in biomedicine, with the COVID, huge amount of publications. I think it's now almost 150,000 articles in PubMed on COVID, and finding reviewers. You know, if I'm getting these spam mails from different journals, when I get a real request for peer review from a legitimate journal, unless it is a widely known journal, then it's very difficult for a researcher to decide whether they are reviewing or whether they are submitting to a legitimate journal. And that affects us, because many people now refuse to review for journals that are really not well established. So that's also a problem for small scholarly journals that are just starting to find their place. They can also steal legitimate journals, or at least mimic them. These are hijacked journals where their numbers are increasing. This is the only data that I could find. So it is really quite difficult to deal with it, and predatory journals are something that we as journal editors ask researchers to think about, especially early career researchers. And I can recommend this site, Think, Check, Submit, which is a kind of a guidance for the researchers to know whether they are submitting to a legitimate journal. So for us, when we talk about quality assurance in editing, and this is coming back to quality check that was asked, the question that was asked to Serge, it's very difficult. I always think about it in kind of medical terms, and this is the kind of structure, process, outcome that is applied to quality assurance in medical care. And we can also apply it to editing. So you have structure, so we have these guidelines, standards, editorial policies that are there, associations where we discuss things. We have processes where how we deal with declaring contributions, conflicts, how we verify the integrity of the articles, how we handle allegations, how we correct literature. And we also have to think about the outcomes. So are we getting better in responsible publishing? That may be quite difficult sometimes because of really the complexity of the issues. I know that when I became the editor a long time ago, and you would think of papers as some kind of manuscripts that you send to reviewers, they read, they say something, we make a decision. But then all of a sudden, digital publishing came in, and then you started hearing about XML and DOIs and data repositories, preprints, registration trials. So the aspect of publishing that is not only about the content of the paper or the IMRAT, so what's written in the paper, what the data show, but everything else around it has become quite important, but it is important to really assure the quality of what we do. And one thing, for example, I just want to emphasize how we deal with emerging or quite old problems, like you have a reviewer who will review the same paper in different journals. This is something that that is very common now in many journals, where you can carry on your peer review. Many journals would ask you, so if it is rejected, can it be sent with the reviews to another journal? And also independently, many journals have policies that if you submit a paper that has been rejected from another journal, has reviewer comments, many journals will not review it from scratch, because that's kind of wasting resources and quality work of reviewers. Many journals would then just take those reviews, ask the authors to revise the manuscript accordingly in a new journal, and provide a revised document. And then they may have one or two more reviewers to check, and then can publish it. So as a conclusion, when we talk about editors and publishing and their responsibility, it is increasing daily, and we hope we kind of do the best we can by being both the editors and researchers. So thank you, and I hope we'll find good outcomes in the end for the whole scientific community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, for an incredibly rich and informative talk. If you mind, would you stop sharing your screen?
I'm trying to.
Excellent.
I'm trying to. I just want to.
So we have only a couple of minutes left for questions. But so here's one that I particularly like from our moderator, Iris Lechner. So she asks, if there's one thing you could change as an editor in the current publication system, and it would happen overnight, what would it be?
I would have more transparency. Open the black box. We are trying to do that, but opening it even more and having more open peer review would be better. We know from research that open peer review doesn't increase the quality of peer review, but it does kind of make the argument and the discussion more collegial and open. So everybody thinks twice what they're going to sign under when they write peer review. So I think taking responsibility is very important for all involved.
Yeah,
There are many things that I would like to change overnight, but
we could only do one.
This is
yeah,
one
this
of
is
them.
great. Yeah. All right. So a question from Heather Tierney. She asks: you mentioned the weaknesses of the journal publisher in terms of the actions they can take, but can you comment more on your thoughts on obligations journals and editors have beyond just the published record?
I mean, we publish a record, and the responsibility for what is published is also with the authors. For example, if we can publish only what is declared, we publish authors' contributions. Very often you see that nobody did statistical analysis, but that's up to authors. You can question them as editors and kind of educate them about the requirement for authorships. If people don't declare conflicts of interest, you cannot deal with it if you don't know what they are. And here, the communication between journals and institutions is crucial, and that's like a very weak link that we have. It's very difficult to write to an institution that doesn't answer, and then you cannot resolve a problem with the integrity of the published record. So this is quite problematic.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything journals and editors can do to improve the communication between institutions and journals?
Actually, there are like clue guidelines now that have come out in collaboration between journal editors and institutions about how this process should work. But it is also quite difficult, especially in terms of legal regulations. I know, for example, if you want as an editor just to get an information about a problem that you may have and you're contacted, I don't know, a research integrity officer somewhere in the States or in Canada, they say, if you mention any names or if you mention a paper, we have to act. Although it's just a question for us, it's not an allegation of true misconduct. They would consider it as an allegation. So sometimes it's quite difficult, the framework in which this collaboration between journals and institutions occur, it can be quite difficult to be productive and to lead to the correction of the record.
All right, thank you. So I'm afraid we've run out of time for this session, but I am pretty sure we learned a lot from your talk. So thanks again for joining us today, and let's put our hands together virtually. Thank you, Anna. So just as in the previous day, we'll now have a number of short pitches. And the one we'll start with, I'll just do the introduction really briefly because we need to have enough time for the pitches themselves. They are much more important than me. So the first speaker is Lucas Helal. He's an assistant professor at the Universidade do Extremo Sul Catarinense. I probably mispronounced that completely. It's in Brazil, and he's going to talk to us about the Observatory of Biomedical Journals initiative online. Lucas, go for it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jiron. Let just me share my screen. And my name is correct. Can you all see me?
Yeah, looks good.
Oh, okay. So thank you all, guys. That's a great pleasure for me and for the whole group. I'm on behalf of all members of the Observatory of the Biomedical Journal Initiative. So just to open my talk, you can find this presentation open at my Open Science Framework, and you can scan this QR code or go to my link, and you can find that. So, and my email is in the bottom of the deck of slides. Let me go. Okay, what's happening? Okay, so what's our background? We all of us, it's just redundancy. The reproducibility crisis and the avoidable waste in research, they play a role nowadays in the biomedical research ecosystem. And who are the guardians? So ultimately, Anna was brilliantly talking about the preprints and the predatory journals problems, but ultimately, still nowadays, the biomedical journals are the gatekeepers of what is in the literature in the vast majority of all. So someone needs to see what is happening with those kind of bias that's maybe implicit on the behaviors of the editors and the other stakeholders that are involved, as like the authors, peer reviewers, and the whole research community as well, and funders. But my talk will be more direction for the editors and the editorial system as a whole. And I'm an editor of a journal. So as a disclosure, I don't have any conflict of interest financial. And this talk, it's for me as well. Okay. So the aim of the Biomedical Observatory of Journals is to foster and to promote transparency, reproducibility, openness, and equity among all of the biomedical literature. And we are all to stimulate the grassroots for the incorporation of the values and the assets that might be translated for the policies and procedures we observe, and we need to audit and provide feedback to the journals, and also to provide what we call by ostensible surveillance that might be a solution, and as well educational initiatives, of course, and it's on the basis of the whole thing. So in a short frame, what is our timeline? We need before we need to see what type of interventions to change behaviors of editorial staffs, and also editors-in-chief, also the whole editorial board. We need to see what may change their behavior. So what kind of interventions they can, what is in the literature, and also synthesize the gathered interventions and tailors as necessary. So that's a preliminary step of the thing. And the second thing is in the domains of transparency, openness, reproducibility, and equity, there's a bunch of outcomes that we can measure and also try to monitor and change over time. And then we need to prioritize this. So we need to synthesize as well, map this thing, and then through a Delphi process or a modified Delphi process, what do you think that may be an appropriate way, we're gonna go for a decision-making process, and then run the interventions. What we call the eligibility criteria for the journal cohort as a pilot for right now. So we will take the journals that will be indexed in its Scopus database, as classified as by internal medicine, cardiology, oncology, psychiatry, pediatrics, and rheumatology. There is a kind of a rationale here, but it's kind of a cherry picking also as well as a pilot. But we see here there is the burden of research in these areas in the clinical research are very prevalent. So this might be a representative sample of the literature. And they must contain also randomized clinical trials for secondary analysis that we might perform. And as for a sample size and endpoints, they should be equally distributed in terms of impact factor. I have a lot of limitations on impact factor, and I think that a lot of people also, but still nowadays, I don't know if we have any other less worst thing to tailor the journals. So we will
Lucas, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. We're almost out of time, so maybe final words here.
No, I'm in the final slide. Okay, so this is we're going to select the subsample of articles of these journals as well, and then to be analyzed. And then we were to try to work together with another initiatives to audit and summarize and provide feedback, to provide ostensible surveillance, and also for educational programs, as I told before. So I would like to thank you all, my steering committee, and also our advisory board, our acknowledgements, and our research staff team. And I'm on for all of the our questions that might be of your interest.
All right, thanks so much, Lucas. And if you do have questions, please do get in touch with Lucas. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them. Our second speaker is Eva Furrer, and she's going to talk to us about PRECHECK, a checklist to evaluate COVID-19 preprints. And she's the scientific coordinator at the Epidemiology, Biostatistics and Prevention Institute at the University of Zurich. So Eva, the screen is yours.
Yeah, I'm here, but I don't see my slides.
The slides will be put up just about now.
Okay.
Good. Go ahead.
So as you said, I'm from the University of Zurich, but I'm the coordinator actually for the Center for Reproducible Science, not for the whole institute. And this is a little project that is together with the University of Geneva. I'm also, in the spirit of this morning, not a main contributor of this project. I'm just one of the helpers. And the main contributors are actually Simon Schwab and Nora Turman, who are postdocs in the mutual groups. The motivation for this project comes from the picture that Simon created that you see here. This is what he and others maybe also call it the preprint-demic that happened with COVID-19. So he went and counted on some of the biggest preprint servers, how many preprints are appearing with COVID-19 related subject every day in a sense. And when he did this in the beginning of this year, he found that it's about 20 per day that appear. And this would only be medRxiv. If you're interested in recreating these things, then there is a link to the code that he did for that. So what is then the idea? What do we want to do with that? And that will be on the next slide. The idea for the project is that we want to create or more or less compile more and based on other people's work, a checklist for COVID preprints or for preprints in general, but specifically COVID here, that would be usable for an informed lay audience that gives a rough idea about the quality of the manuscript as a kind of a screening tool, and that teaches at the same time about scientific literacy or critical thinking, if you want, a little bit as a byproduct. And specifically also gives information on what are actually preprints for many persons who will not know the difference. And the idea appeared when we all of a sudden during last year saw preprints appearing in the news. So on your free journal in the morning when you go to work, we all of a sudden saw preprints appear, which I at least never saw before. So the idea was to give this introduction a little bit into scientific literacy. And as an easy means for us, in a sense, how do we get to that lay audience? That's not very easy. We try to use an audience that is close to us and close to lay audience, and that are our starting undergraduate students, so students in their first or second semester. And also we wanted to collaborate with the people who worked in our press offices, because they also had the contacts about preprints with the press. And now what did we try to put on that checklist is on the next slide. We have a provisional idea what items we want to put there. It's 6 items, and you see here as an example the first one. I don't go in the details, it's just to show you the structure. So we will ask one or more simple questions. They may not be all that simple, and not everyone may be able to answer them really precisely, but the important thing is to think about those questions. And we explain why it is important to think about those questions, and those who want to go deeper into the matter, they can then read or think about the things that we offer in this Let's Dig Deeper section. On the next slide, you see the other items that we for the moment suggest. Sorry. There would be study type, a few questions on transparency, limitations on reporting. We come from a biomedical background, so reporting guidelines are important to us. And research integrity, this makes the link to the day and the last few days. And if you read quickly what's on there, we talked about many of these things like ethics approvals, conflicts of interest, and what are contributors' roles. Where are we going with this is on the next slide. Our next step is also some sort of a modified Delphi approach. We want to review our checklist with other experts. Contact me if you want to be one of those experts, and then deploy it once it's done, really in our lectures, and that will be psychology students, medicine students, and hopefully also economic students, which then could give us a small scale evaluation of the effectiveness of the checklist. And we want to do those training workshops with the press officers. We can't do them together. It's French and German, but maybe we will see. And you can stay up to date with us on our website where all the progress will be reported. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eva. This is a wonderful initiative. I'm really impressed. So on to our third speaker, and that will be Sandra Lopez. She has a PhD from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and I'm actually not sure about her current affiliation, but she can probably tell us. Her topic is Predatory Journals. Do not judge journals by their editorial board members. Sandra, please take it away.
Yes, hi, thank you for the invitation. Do you see my slides?
Not yet, but maybe they're almost there. Are you sharing your own screen, or do we have your...
Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Great.
So I'm in New Jersey. I work at a pharma company and at Rutgers University. I'm going to talk about predatory journals and why we should not judge a journal based on the editorial board member. So first of all, briefly, I'm going to tell you what a predatory journal is. These are journals that the only purpose that they exist is for business. So they want to charge to publish. And they don't do any sort of quality control. They don't offer editorial services, nor peer reviews or anything. They appear legitimate. Some of them even take the name of a very well-known journal, and they replicate. They put a online website where you can submit your paper, and it's published in that journal, which you know, but it's really not that one, the original one. It's a huge problem because it contaminates science. So there's this publication which has not been peer reviewed that is published in a journal, and then another researcher referenced that paper, and little by little we don't know which is real and which is not. So it's really a huge problem. For the pseudo journals, these predatory journals, they do have a list of editors in their board. But the question of our paper was, these editors are real? So what we did is we took 7 predatory publishers that we knew they were predatory. There were 38 journals in there. So we took all the name of the editors there, and we looked for the country, university, position, degree, how many citations they had, the H index, to see the profile of these editors. And as a second step, we did a questionnaire, and we looked in the journals and in internet for their websites, and we sent them a questionnaire asking them, do you know you are listed as an editor of this journal? So the result is that in these editors, there are all types of profiles, like from starters, juniors, researchers, to very experienced researchers. We even found about 3 editors that had died about 5 years ago. There were all types. It was from 74 countries in 650 universities, but most of them were highly qualified MD, PhD, with a high record of publication, but very well-known universities. Yeah, 53% were MDs, 72.6 PhDs. The median publication, and it's 43, and the H index was 14. We were pretty surprised that most of them were very high qualified, and this is a reason we decided to go a second step and send them a questionnaire. And it was a big surprise that 87 of those editors were not aware. We even got a lot of emails asking us, like, how can we get removed from that? And thank you for letting me know. And they were like, I've sent them like 5 emails and nobody responds, and there's no way to take my name out of that list. So there's a lot we can discuss about this. But first of all, we have to make aware of predatory journals. I'm still surprised that many authors, many scientists do not know that predatory journals exist. Really have to teach all our students about this problem. There's a lot of literature on how we can prevent. There's one website that's Think, Check, and Submit. And there's a lot of publications that give step-by-step how can we are aware and identify predatory journals. So I'm not going to go into detail about this. And my conclusion, well, our conclusion is in the title of this publication, which is do not judge journals by the editorial board members. If you're in doubt, you can always send an email to that editor and ask them, are you an editor? Because they will probably answer immediately. These are very well-known people. And to conclude and close this, I think also the conclusion that goes along with the previous talk is if peer reviews are open and we can see them, it might help with this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. This is really important work that you're doing. So thanks for sharing it with us today. So our final talk before the break is a pre-recorded one by Christian Wendelborn. Christian works at the interdisciplinary research project DataBlick at the German Cancer Research Center in Heidelberg. And he's going to talk about funding agencies' responsibilities to foster research integrity.
Data sharing policies of public funding agencies. How to foster good scientific practice. In this short pitch, I'd like to answer 2 questions. Do public funding agencies have a duty to foster research integrity and good scientific practice? And a second question, how can they foster research integrity and good scientific practice? I want to answer these questions by way of an example, namely the example of data sharing policies, which can be considered as a tool to foster research integrity. Coming to the first question. Do public funding agencies have a duty to foster research integrity and good scientific practice? Well, of course. There are lots of reasons for this, but I'd like to confine myself to 2 reasons for the purposes of this pitch. Funders are a relevant part of the science system, and they have a huge impact on scientific culture. Particularly when the scientific culture evolves slowly and hesitantly, as is the case, for example, with data sharing, funding agencies might have a big impact on cultural change. The second reason is public funding agencies spend public money to fund research. And therefore the public, as well as the scientific community, has a legitimate interest that funded researchers abide by the norms of research integrity. The second question, how can public funding agencies foster research integrity and good scientific practice? I'd like to answer this question with the example of data sharing policies. As you might know, data sharing is deemed as very important and beneficial for science in many different respects. And I want to argue that data sharing can therefore be considered as good scientific practice, at least in two respects. The first respect is that data sharing enables reproducibility or replicability. And considered against the backdrop of the so-called replicability crisis, the sharing of data might be a crucial step towards ending this crisis. The second respect in which data sharing can be considered good scientific practice is that it enables new research, and it enables new research more efficiently. Unfortunately, data sharing is not yet a widespread and common practice, even though, as I argued, it should be considered as good scientific practice. And against this backdrop, the following statement, directed at public funding agencies, seems to be very plausible. Requirements to share data in an archive with clear and ethically sound access and reuse conditions as part of the grant agreement, with mechanisms for monitoring and sanctioning, might foster this good scientific practice. And I'd like to add that, seen from the perspective of research ethics, public funding agencies should implement such requirements. Now there's a possible objection to this idea. Some people might claim that requirements like the ones presented impede academic freedom of researchers. And although I cannot argue for this extensively here, I'd like to reply in a nutshell and say that academic freedom does not protect bad scientific practice. And if data sharing has to be considered as good scientific practice and not sharing data as some kind of bad scientific practice, it cannot impede academic freedom to require researchers to share their data. Coming to a close, I like to highlight 3 claims. The first one, funders should play a more active role in fostering good scientific practice in funded projects. The second claim, it is legitimate to require researchers to share data for replication studies and reuse, and to monitor compliance and sanction non-compliance. And the third claim, this does not violate academic freedom in a relevant sense. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Christian, for recording that video. So that brings us to our lunch break, but before we part, a quick thing or two. We'll be back here at 1:45, so please do join us this afternoon because we'll have more interesting talks. In fact, we'll have 2 talks from people who are scientific publishers and 1 talk from someone who's radically trying to reimagine the future of science. And then we'll close with a panel discussion. So it's going to be an exciting afternoon. Enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you at 1:45.